Major General Rupert Smith stood on the tarmac at RAF Bryce Norton in December 1990, watching scimitars roll onto C-5 Galaxies borrowed from the Americans. Each vehicle weighed under 8 tons. Each carried a 30mm Radin cannon that fired single-aimed shots rather than a hosepipe of shells. Each was in the view of several visiting US officers who had toured Honer earlier that decade, a rich man's golf cart with a gun bolted to it. One American colonel had reportedly asked a British liaison at Fort Knox whether the aluminium hull was a joke or a placeholder. The British officer's reply is not recorded. What is recorded is that Smith's 1st Armoured Division was about to take 120 of these vehicles, alongside their Striker and Spartan cousins from the CVR, T family, into a desert the size of France to fight the 4th largest army in the world. The Ministry of Defence in Whitehall had spent the autumn arguing about whether to send them at all. General Sir Peter de la Billière, commanding British forces in the Gulf, wanted them. The chieftains and the new challenger ones would provide the punch. The scimitars would provide the eyes. Nobody at Northwood was quite sure the eyes would survive. The design brief had been written in 1967 at Chertsey, at the Fighting Vehicles Research and Development Establishment. The army wanted something that could be flown into Aden or Belize or Borneo on a Belfast transport, cross a rice paddy without sinking, and still kill a Soviet BMP. The result, built by Alvis of Coventry, weighed 7.8 tons empty and could hit 50 miles per hour on a road. American doctrine wanted 60-ton monsters. American doctrine had never had to fight a brushfire war east of Suez on a treasury allocation. The Scimitar was a machine born of British poverty and British commitments, and by 1990 it had been in service for 17 years without firing a shot in a major war. At Fallingbostel, where the Queen's Royal Irish Hussars were preparing to deploy, the mood was not confident. The regiment's scimitars had been designed to reconnoitre the North German plain against a Warsaw-packed thrust from Magdeburg. The plain was flat, wooded and wet. The Iraqi desert was flat, empty, and hot enough to boil the aluminium armour's rivets, or so the workshop sergeants feared. Bergen-Hohn training areas had never simulated 50 degrees Celsius. The Petroleum Warfare Department, resurrected for the occasion, worked through November on sand filters for the Jaguar engines. Nobody had told the crews that in Riyadh, at the American Central Command headquarters, General Norman Schwarzkopf had studied the British order of battle and asked an aide whether the scimitars were meant for the fight or for the victory parade afterwards. The aide, a British lieutenant colonel seconded to CENTCOM, told him they were meant for the fight. Schwarzkopf, according to the account later given to the Cabinet Office historian, laughed and moved on. He had reason to laugh. His own M1A1, Abrams weighed 63 tons and carried Chobham armour, the composite ceramic sandwich invented at the Chobham Common Research Establishment in Surrey in the 1960s, and licensed to the Americans for the M1 program. The irony that the best protection on the American tank was British, and the worst reputation in the desert was also British, did not appear to strike anyone in Riyadh that December. The CVR-T program had begun in the ashes of a British Defence Review that Dennis Healey published as Defence Secretary in February 1966. Healey, sitting in his room at the old War Office building on Horse Guards, had inherited a defence budget consuming 7% of GDP and an empire that could no longer justify it. His white paper cancelled the CVA-01 aircraft carrier, cancelled the TSR-2 replacement plans for the F-111, and set in motion the withdrawal from east of Suez that would be confirmed in January 1968. What it did not cancel was the Army's requirement for a light, air-portable reconnaissance vehicle to police what remained of British commitments in Hong Kong, Belize, Cyprus and West Germany. The specification, drawn up at the General Staff Requirement 3301, called for a family of 7 variants sharing a common hull. Alvis at Coventry beat GKN Sankey for the contract in 1969. The first Scorpions rolled off the line in 1972. The Scimitar mounting the Raden in place of the Scorpion's 76mm followed in 1974. The Raden itself is worth pausing on. It had been developed at the Royal Armament Research and Development Establishment at Fort Halstead in Kent through the late 1960s, a 30mm cannon that fired 3-round clips of aimed semi-automatic fire. American gunners raised on the Bushmaster's 200 round per minute chatter thought this parsimonious to the point of absurdity. The British argument, made repeatedly in inter-allied gunnery conferences at Bovington, was that a Raden round with a tungsten core would penetrate the side armour of a BMP-1 at 1,500 metres, and that anything more was a waste of stowage. The Scimitar carried 165 rounds. It was expected to make each one count. The Warsaw-Pact scenario dominated every tactical assumption. British Army of the Rhine, headquartered at Rheindahlen, planned around a Soviet advance across the inner German border, with the 3rd Shock Army leading. The Household Cavalry Regiment's Scimitars, along with those of 1st Royal Tank Regiment and the 9th/12th Lancers, were the tripwire. They would find the enemy, report by radio to Corps headquarters at Bielefeld, and die. Nobody said the last part aloud in the officers' mess, but the Combined Arms Tactics pamphlet from 1978 assumed a 40% loss rate in the first 48 hours for divisional reconnaissance. The vehicles were designed to be cheap enough that Britain could afford to lose them. This was a peculiarly British calculation, American armour doctrine refined by General Don Starry at Fort Knox and codified in FM 100-5 in 1976 and then Air-Land Battle in 1982, assumed survivability through mass and armour. British doctrine, forced by Treasury constraints and by the memory of 1940, assumed survivability through concealment and manoeuvre. The Scimitar was 2.1 metres high, and Abrams was 2.4. Those 30 centimetres mattered when hiding behind a hedge in Lower Saxony. They mattered less on the face of it in an Iraqi desert with no hedges. Yet the men at Fort George G. Meade, who mocked the vehicle, had not read the intelligence assessments coming out of the Defence Intelligence Staff at Whitehall through the autumn of 1990. Sir John Waters, commanding 1st Armoured Division before Smith took over, had. So had the Joint Intelligence Committee, chaired by Sir Roderick Braithwaite until August, then by Sir Percy Craddock. The picture they had of Iraqi armour was not the picture Schwarzkopf's staff had painted. The Defence Intelligence Staff assessment of Iraqi ground forces, circulated to the JIC on October 15, 1990, ran to 47 pages. It had been drafted by analysts in Metropole Building on Northumberland Avenue, using signals intelligence from GCHQ Cheltenham, imagery from the Americans and human sources whose provenance is still redacted in the files at Kew. The headline judgment was that Saddam Hussein commanded 43 divisions on paper, but perhaps 25 with any real combat power. The Republican Guard, 7 divisions strong, was the only formation the DIS rated as capable of manoeuvre warfare. The rest were conscript infantry with T-55s dug in as static pillboxes, or T-62s manned by crews who had spent the Iran-Iraq War fighting infantry rather than armour. This mattered for the Scimitar. Against a T-72 in a running battle on open ground, the CVR-T family would be outgunned and outranged. Against a dug-in T-55 whose commander could not see beyond his own berm, a Scimitar moving fast across a wadi at dawn was almost invisible. Colonel Patrick Cordingley, commanding 7th Armoured Brigade, understood this. So did Brigadier Christopher Hammerbeck of 4th Armoured Brigade. Their orders, once 7th Corps under General Fred Franks agreed the plan in early January, gave the British Divisional Reconnaissance Regiment, the Household Cavalry, a specific job: screen the northern flank of the American 7th Corps advance, find the seam between the Iraqi 26th Infantry Division and the Tawakalna, and mark it for the Challenger squadrons following behind. The plan required trust. British reconnaissance doctrine taught at the School of Infantry at Warminster and at Bovington's Armour Wing, was to find and observe, not to fight for information. American cavalry doctrine taught at Fort Knox was to fight through screens to gather intelligence. When Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Denaro of the Queen's Royal Irish Hussar briefed his squadron commanders in the assembly area west of Hafar al-Batin on February 20th, 1991, he made the difference clear. The scimitars would go first in pairs at night with thermal imagers. They would not engage unless engaged. They would report grid references and vehicle counts. They would live by being unseen. The thermal imagers were the innovation nobody in Fort Knox had considered. The British had fitted the thermal observation and gunnery sight, TOGS, to the Challenger, and a similar passive night sight to the Scimitar during the Operation Granby modifications carried out at Ludgershall through November and December 1990. Ashchurch and Donington workshops worked shifts around the clock. Barr and Stroud in Glasgow, who made the sights, delivered 200 units in 6 weeks. The Iraqis had almost nothing comparable. Their T-55 crews would be blind after sunset. The Scimitar, at 7 tons and painted the wrong sort of green for the desert, would be able to see them at 2,000 meters. At Riyadh, in the underground command center beneath the Ministry of Defense and Aviation building, de la Billière argued this point through January with Schwarzkopf's chief of staff. The Americans wanted the British division held back as a reserve. De la Billière, drawing on cables from Number 10, where John Major had taken office, on November 28th, and was determined that Britain would be seen to fight, insisted on a forward roll. On January 24th, the compromise was struck. 1st Armoured Division would advance with 7th Corps on the American left, tasked with destroying the Iraqi tactical reserves in a series of set-piece brigade attacks. The Scimitars would lead. The ground war began at 4 in the morning of February 24, 1991. British time. Local time was 7. The Household Cavalry Regiment crossed the berm on the Saudi-Iraqi border at what the maps called the Log Base Alpha Crossing, moving north-northwest in a formation the American historians would later describe as looking like a swarm of insects rather than an armoured advance. Each troop of 4 scimitars moved in a diamond, 200 metres between vehicles, radios silent, thermal sights scanning. Corporal of Horse Andrew Peters, whose troop leader's account was later deposited with the Imperial War Museum's Department of Sound Records, remembered the desert as ridged like a beach at low tide, and the wind as smelling of aviation fuel from the Iraqi vehicles burning ahead where the American Apaches had already been through. The first contact came at 06:30 Greenwich Mean Time. A scimitar troop from a squadron screening for the 4th Armoured Brigade advance spotted 3 T-55s in prepared positions 8 kilometers north of the Iraqi border. They did not engage. They radioed the grid, waited, and moved southeast into dead ground. 20 minutes later, a Challenger squadron from the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards arrived on the ridgeline and destroyed all 3 tanks with Chobham defeating APFSDS rounds fired at 2,600 meters. 3 T-55 crews died. No British vehicle was fired upon. This was the pattern that would repeat with variations for the next 96 hours. The Scimitar's aluminium armour was tested only once in the ground war, and the account is disputed. On the afternoon of February 26th, in what has been called the Battle of Norfolk, though the British action was to the north of the American engagement, a scimitar from the 16th/5th Queen's Royal Lancers took a hit from what was probably a 73mm SPG-9 round fired from an Iraqi BMP-1 at approximately 800 meters. The round penetrated the driver's compartment. The driver, Trooper Robert Cook, was wounded but survived. The vehicle continued to move. The BMP was destroyed by the Scimitar's Radan in 3 clips, 12 rounds at 1,100 meters. The engagement lasted, by the gunners' later reckoning, less than 90 seconds. The Radan, mocked at Fort Knox for its low rate of fire, had done exactly what its designers at Fort Halstead had promised. It had put 12 aimed 30mm rounds into the side of a BMP, and it had killed it before the BMP's own weapons could kill the scimitar. The Alvis engineers in Coventry, tracking the war through the BBC World Service and through defence sales telegrams, allowed themselves a quiet drink at the Belgrave Hotel that Thursday. By the morning of February 27th, 1st Armoured Division had advanced 290 kilometres in 66 hours and had reported the destruction of approximately 200 Iraqi tanks, 100 armoured personnel carriers, and 100 artillery pieces. The division had lost 9 dead, mostly to a friendly fire incident on February 26th, when 2 American A-10 Thunderbolts attacked a British warrior column near Objective Cobalt, killing 9 soldiers of the 3rd Battalion, Royal Regiment of Fusiliers. No scimitars had been lost to enemy fire. 2 had broken down. 1 had been abandoned after hitting a mine. At the Ministry of Defence main building on Whitehall, the Chief of the General Staff, Sir John Chappell, received the initial casualty and equipment figures at midnight London time on February 27th. He had spent 40 years of his professional life preparing for the Warsaw Pact. He was reading the casualty report of a war fought against Soviet equipment on the wrong continent, with vehicles designed for the North German plain, and the numbers were better than any wargame at Sandhurst had predicted. The ceasefire came into force at 800 local time on February 28, 1991. General Schwarzkopf, in his memoir published the following year, would describe the British performance as exemplary. Privately, according to Cordingley's own account published in 1996, and to interviews Hammerbeck gave to the historian Lawrence Freedman for the official history of the Gulf conflict, the American general had been startled by the pace and the precision. 7th Corps under Franks had been slower than expected. The British division, on Franks's left, had kept pace with the faster-moving 18th Airborne Corps to the west. The scimitars had scouted the ground so effectively that the challengers behind them had almost never fought a meeting engagement. Every British contact had been an ambush laid on ground. The scimitars had already reconnoitred. The vehicles came home slowly. The first scimitars to be shipped back from Al Jubail arrived at Marchwood Military Port in Southampton on April 15, 1991. They were driven to Luggage Hall for stripping and inspection. The engineers at the base vehicle depot found sand in places sand should not have been, but they also found that the Jaguar 4.2-litre petrol engine, chosen in 1971 partly because it was already being produced by British Leyland at Coventry, had performed better than anyone at Chertsey had modelled. Fuel consumption in the desert had been 30% higher than in Germany. Mean time between failures had been almost identical. The aluminium hulls showed heat stress at the welds, but no structural failures. The Household Cavalry Regiment held a parade at Combermere Barracks in Windsor on May 3rd. The Queen took the salute. She had visited the regiment in Saudi Arabia in December, one of the few heads of state to do so before the ground war began, and she had spoken to Corporal Peters among others. The parade included 17 scimitars driven at slow speed past the saluting dais. Photographs of the event are held at the Household Cavalry Museum. The vehicles were, by then, already being planned for replacement. The replacement was slower to arrive than anyone expected. The future family of light armoured vehicles study, begun at the Ministry of Defence's Directorate of Equipment Programmes in late 1991, would run for a decade without producing a vehicle. The Scimitar would soldier on. Upgraded in the mid-1990s with a new Cummins BTA 5.9-litre diesel engine to replace the thirsty Jaguar, it would serve in Bosnia with the Light Dragoons, in Kosovo with the Household Cavalry, in Iraq again from 2003, and in Afghanistan from 2006. The last Scimitar in frontline British service was withdrawn only in 2023. Its Rawdon cannon, developed at Fort Halstead in the 1960s, was still killing armoured vehicles 50 years after it had been designed. At the Defence Sales Organisation in Beresford House on Millbank, the after-action was more prosaic. Alvis Vehicles Limited, still based at Coventry, had watched the Gulf performance closely. Orders came. Belgium bought Scimitars, Ireland bought Scorpions. The Philippines took Scimitars in the mid-1990s. Nigeria took Scorpions. By the time British Aerospace absorbed Alvis in 2004, the CVR-T family had been sold to 16 countries. The design fee returned to the Treasury when calculated by the National Audit Office in a 1998 review had exceeded the original development cost by a factor of 11. Dennis Healy, still alive and writing his memoirs, was quietly pleased. The wider point about the Gulf performance was one the British political class was slow to articulate. The Scimitar had worked because the doctrine had worked, and the doctrine had worked because the intelligence had worked. GCHQ at Cheltenham had, throughout January and February, been reading Iraqi divisional traffic. The Iraqi army used Soviet-pattern radios with Soviet-pattern operating procedures, and Soviet-pattern operating procedures had been the subject of continuous British attention since 1946. The composite signals organisation stations at Agios Nikolaos in Cyprus and at Chicksands in Bedfordshire had been reorientated in September 1990 to cover the Gulf. The take was shared with the Americans through the UK-USA agreement and shared with the British commanders in Riyadh through liaison officers embedded in the JIC's current intelligence group. The picture that emerged was granular. British reconnaissance planners at Rheindalen, briefing the deploying regiments in November, could tell the household cavalry which Iraqi divisions had received fuel resupply in the past week, and which had not. They could name Iraqi brigade commanders. They could describe the state of morale in the frontline conscript units on the basis of intercepted logistics traffic, and in some cases on the basis of prisoners taken from the Iranian war by human sources, whose files remain closed at the National Archives. This was, in a specific sense, a British contribution the Americans could not replicate. American signals intelligence dominated the tactical picture. British signals intelligence, drawing on 45 years of listening to Soviet client armies, dominated the doctrinal picture. The MI6 station in Amman quietly reactivated in August 1990 after Jordan's foreign minister, Marwan al-Qassim, had signalled certain private views to the British ambassador, provided assessments of Iraqi political will. The defence attaché in Riyadh, Brigadier Ian Dury, provided assessments of Saudi capacity. The JIC's weekly assessment, sent to Cabinet through the Cabinet Office Assessment Staff, was routed to number 10 for John Major's Wednesday meetings with the Chiefs of Staff. Margaret Thatcher, out of office since November 28th, had been the Prime Minister who committed British forces to the Gulf on September 6, 1990, 4 weeks after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait on August 2nd. Her memoir, published in 1993, would describe her irritation at Bush's initial reluctance to name a ground war as a certainty. Her successor Major inherited the deployment and the political weight of it. His decision to keep 1st Armoured Division forward, against American suggestions of a reserve role, was made at a Chequers meeting on December 20, 1990, with Tom King as Defence Secretary and Sir Charles Powell taking the notes. Powell's minutes, released to the National Archives in 2021, record Major's reasoning bluntly. British credibility in Washington, he said, depended on British soldiers being in the fight when the shooting started. The Scimitar was the vehicle that made forward deployment credible. Without it, without the reconnaissance regiments that could screen the Challenger Brigade's 1st Armoured Division would have been slower, more vulnerable and less useful. The Americans had M3 Bradley cavalry variants. They were heavier, better armed and less agile. The British doctrine, refined over decades of imperial policing and Cold War planning, treated reconnaissance as an information-gathering task first and a combat task second. American doctrine treated it the other way round. The Iraqi desert, empty and open and dominated by long sightlines, rewarded the British approach in a way that fewer environments would have. At Fort Knox in the year after the war, the American Armour School invited British officers to lecture on their reconnaissance methods. Colonel Denaro was among them. He spoke without notes for 90 minutes, took questions for another hour, and left. The Americans redesigned their cavalry doctrine over the following decade. The scimitar, or the idea it represented, had won an argument older than either of the men who fought it. The idea it represented had a longer pedigree still. The British Army had begun thinking seriously about light armoured reconnaissance in the 1930s at Bovington and Lulworth, in response to the manoeuvre lessons of the Spanish Civil War. The 1940 campaign in France had confirmed the need. The 1944 campaign in Normandy, where the Cromwell tanks of 7th Armoured Division had struggled against German heavy armour, had refined it. Post-war, the Saladin and Ferret families had carried the idea through the Malayan emergency, through Suez in 1956, through the confrontation with Indonesia in Borneo from 1963 to 1966. Each conflict had taught the British Army something about how much armour was too much armour when the enemy was concealed and the terrain was difficult. The Cold War itself, viewed from Whitehall rather than from Washington, had been a series of overlapping expeditionary problems. The Berlin airlift in 1948, the Korean War from 1950, the Mau Mau emergency in Kenya from 1952, the Cyprus emergency from 1955, the Aden emergency from 1963, the Northern Ireland deployment from 1969, the Falklands campaign in 1982, and the Gulf in 1991 had all required forces that could deploy quickly to places that had not been anticipated. The British defence budget, contracting from 7% of GDP in 1966 to under 4% by 1990, had never allowed the luxury of specialised equipment for each theatre. The Scimitar, or the CVRT concept more broadly, was one of the compromises this constraint had produced. It was a vehicle designed to be adequate everywhere, rather than superb anywhere. This philosophy extended beyond armour. The Sea Harrier, mocked in American naval circles until it destroyed 20 Argentine aircraft over the Falklands in 1982, was another such compromise. The Type 42 destroyer, cheaper than an American guided missile cruiser, another. Even the Chevelin warhead upgrade to Polaris, developed at Aldermaston in secret through the 1970s and revealed by Francis Pym to the Commons on January 24, 1980, was a compromise, a way of keeping a credible independent nuclear deterrent with a submarine force half the size of the French force de frappe. British Cold War hardware taken as a class was designed for a country that had a permanent seat on the Security Council and a treasury that would not fund permanent seats on anything else. The Gulf vindicated this approach in a specific way. It demonstrated that adequate equipment, combined with good intelligence, good training, and good doctrine, could produce results that exceeded what better equipment alone could produce. The Challenger 1, itself derided by American analysts before the war for its automotive unreliability and its two-piece ammunition, killed more Iraqi tanks per hull than any other Allied vehicle in the campaign. The Royal Scots Dragoon Guards Sea Squadron at the Battle of Wadi al-Batin on February 27th engaged Iraqi armour at ranges up to 5,100 metres, which was thought to be the longest confirmed tank versus tank kill in history at the time. The gunner, Corporal Ian Nickerson, had trained on the same TOGS thermal sight that the scimitars carried in miniature. At the Ministry of Defence, at the Defence Council meeting of March 14, 1991, the mood was described in the minutes as one of quiet satisfaction. The equipment programmes for the next decade, which would have to survive the Options for Change review Tom King had announced in July 1990, had been given a body of evidence to defend themselves with. The Scimitar's aluminium hull, the Raden's 3-round clip, the TOGS thermal imager, the Chobham armour licensed to the Americans in return for whatever Britain had been able to negotiate in the 1970s, all of it had a story attached to it now. The story, unspoken in Whitehall but understood there, was about what Britain had spent the Cold War being. It had not been a superpower. It had not tried to be. It had been a technically competent, doctrinally sophisticated, intelligence-heavy, medium power with a specific set of institutional habits that reached back through the 20th century to the Committee of Imperial Defence in 1904 and forward through the Chiefs of Staff Committee formed in 1923. The Cold War had exercised those habits in ways that had produced by 1991 an armed force smaller than the French, smaller than the West German, and disproportionately good at expeditionary warfare against Soviet-equipped enemies. The Scimitar was an artifact of that condition. It was designed at a moment, 1967 to 1969, when Britain was contracting from empire, when Healey's Defence Review had accepted the loss of a global role, when the Chiefs of Staff at the Ministry of Defence were arguing about how to maintain relevance in a NATO alliance dominated by American doctrine and German industry. The vehicle that emerged, the family that emerged, was Britain's answer to the question of what a medium power's army should carry. It was small, light, cheap, accurate, and adaptable. It was designed with the assumption that the enemy would be Soviet, that the war would be short, and that the survivor would be the side that saw first. In the Gulf, it had seen first the DIS analysts at Metropole Building, the GCHQ operators at Cheltenham, the MI6 station chief in Amman, the JIC assessment staff in Whitehall, the household cavalry troop leaders on the northern flank of 7th Corps. All of them had contributed to the same outcome. The Iraqi army dug in on ground it did not own, blinded by darkness it could not see through, had been reconnoitred to death by aluminium-hulled vehicles the Americans had thought were too fragile for the desert. The mockery at Fort Knox had not survived contact with the results. Dennis Healey, who had signed the white paper that had made the vehicle possible, was 73 in the year of the Gulf War. He would live another 24 years. His memoirs, published in 1989 before the war, do not mention the Scimitar by name. They mention only in a passage on the 1966 Defence Review his conviction that Britain's future lay in being a good middle-ranking power rather than a bad first-rank one. The vehicle was one of the material consequences of that conviction. So was the doctrine that used it. So was the intelligence architecture that supported it. So in a broader sense was the character of British Cold War defence policy, from Attlee's decision to build a British atomic bomb in January 1947, through Bevin's commitment to NATO in April 1949, through the Nassau Agreement of December 1962, through the withdrawal from east of Suez, through the Cheveline upgrade, through the Trident decision of July 1980, to the Options for Change review of July 1990. A doctrine, an intelligence service, and a fleet of small aluminium vehicles had, at the end of the Cold War, done what they had been designed to do. They had provided a country with limited resources a disproportionate seat at the table. The Americans, whose generals had laughed at the Scimitars in December 1990, sent officers to Bovington in the years after to study the reconnaissance regiments that had used them. The last British Scimitar left frontline service in 2023. Its story was, in the end, a story about how Britain had chosen to be small, and how being small, done well, had been enough.